The Technological Uncanny as a Permanent Structure of Selfhood. This is the title of the text that I have written and you have read, or hopefully you will read. And this is also the title of this lecture. Let me first give you the structure of this lecture. So I will start with sketching a context. Then I will explain briefly this notion of the uncanny valley. After that, I will go into and introduce an alternative, what I will call an alternative explanation of this uncanny valley, and coin this notion of the otherness of the self as extimacy, a notion that I borrow from another author. And I will end with a question. I will not answer that question, but I will address it, and I think it's a very important question, namely, how to be closed open for intrusive technologies. First, the context. The context, and this is a key notion that I'm also in my work very much interested in, the notion of self-formation. And self-formation is often introduced as kind of a promise of our postmodern era. So the idea is that in the past there were a lot of different kind of confinements, things that posed kind of limits to our freedom. For example, for some people, religion or tradition or family and culture. And the idea is that now, today, so starting with the postmodern era, we have liberated ourselves from those confinements, and then we can form ourselves in a way that we choose, that we prefer. And we see now a movement, and this is of course not very new. You had that also in the past in different forms. A movement that puts its hope in technology. Sometimes this movement calls itself also transhumanist or transhumanist movement. And their idea is that if we can kind of form ourselves the way we please, why then not enhance ourselves? And they believe enhancing ourselves in a very kind of radical way could be done by using and embodying different technologies. This is a bit the context where I kind of come in, is taking as a starting point that these technologies that we want to use and embody are never technologies that are only a kind of a means to realize a goal, but that these technologies also are normative. They norm what we consider successful or good self-formation, and even what we would consider an enhanced self. So in other words, these technologies also intrinsically pose, in a certain sense, limits again to the direction that we want to form ourselves. So in other words, ergo, we do not completely possess the self that we attempt to form. And I think it is important to recognize this also in the light of developing quite radical intrusive technologies, and that also pose different ethical and political questions with regard to how critically we have to relate to this technology. So this is a bit the context of the lecture. First, let me tell you a bit about the uncanny valley, because I will, by explaining the uncanny valley in a certain way, I will use that as a vehicle to ultimately make my own claim, namely that there is also something kind of strange, not only in the robot that we are confronted with, I will tell you more about that in a second, but also this confrontation reveals something also about ourselves that is very important and existential, that we need to recognize, and that has also implications for how we relate to new and emerging technologies. I don't know if you know this notion of the uncanny valley, but very simply put, the idea is that as a robot or other artifact becomes more human-like, there is an increase in its acceptability. So this goes fine, but then as it approaches a nearly human state, responses quickly turn to strong revulsion. And in a quite seminal paper, the Japanese robot scholar Masahiro Mori has explained this, and you see this also in the graph. So there is first kind of an increase in acceptability, but then if this robot comes too close, is too human-like, there is a drop. So the response then quickly turns to revulsion and repulsion. And there have been different explanations for this uncanny valley. But before I go into the different explanations, the interesting thing is that there is a very little distance between the last instance where we still appreciate the robot and the first moment that we feel repelled. And I will also work with this idea of a little distance because it indicates that it is minor differences that instigate this uncanny feeling. I will not go into all the different explanations for the uncanny valley. I only show them to you here on this slide, and you can read about them in the paper. But just to mention one, some scholars believe that we respond in this eerie way to the robot that is very human-like because in one way or another it reminds us of our own mortality. So this would be the mortality salience. And there are all kind of other different explanations, and of course there is nothing conclusive here, and it's an ongoing discussion. But I want to highlight only one hypothesis that I think it's very powerful, and I will build on that hypothesis and then introduce my own kind of view by responding to that hypothesis, and that's the so-called dehumanization hypothesis. Wang, Lilienfeld, and Rochert introduced this hypothesis, and they take as first as a starting point that observers spontaneously perceive a human replica as a person, and they claim that that's quite a plausible assumption because when we are confronted with a robot, we in one way or another implicitly assume that this is a kind of a human. So they introduce this hypothesis which says that this uncanny feeling must then be understood as a response to a lack of humanness. So first you think, hey, this robot is a human, and then after kind of engaging with this robot, you feel that there's something wrong. It's not there. It lacks something, and so the first, you could say, very rudimentary appreciation turns into revulsion. So the more, and this is a quote from these authors, the more human observers attribute human-like characteristics to a human replica, the more likely detecting its mechanistic features triggers the dehumanization process that would lead to the uncanny feeling. So the more we approach a robot and in terms of kind of this is a human, and the more we experience this uncanniness because we then recognize that there are certain traits in this machine, in this robot, that are strange, that we do not completely kind of also recognize in humans, and then we respond negatively to that. This is an interesting psychological explanation. So the difference between having or not having this humanness from this psychological perspective seems to manifest itself in very subtle and elusive features. And psychologists often focus on two things: a lack of emotions and a lack of warmth. So those emotions kind of explain, in a certain sense, from a psychological point of view, the difference between a robot and a human. But this is psychological perspective. What I try to add to that is a so-called existential philosophical perspective, because this psychological perspective and this psychological explanation triggers a very kind of complex question, namely, and this is what I call the looming little big question: what makes the ability to feel and sense human? would be, for example, consider a robot that can feel and says humanly human, and even more fundamental question, what makes humanness? So what makes a human human, which is of course a very complex but also deep fundamental philosophical question. So the psychological accounts of feelings of uncanniness seem to allow us to see something that may have otherwise remained hidden, something strange about our own identity and existence. So, in other words, you could use this observation, the psychological observation, as a kind of a vehicle to find out something that remained unhidden, something strange about ourselves. And this is what I try to further thematize in the paper. And on the basis of this kind of turn, I'll I'll introduce kind of an alternative explanation of the uncanny valley. And I then take up also this notion that I have mentioned earlier, this notion of minor differences. And I do that, and I cannot go into that here, but you can read it in the paper. I do that by going back actually to authors that have introduced this notion of uncanniness, namely Jentsch and Freud, and then Lacan gives it a twist. And I'm actually even more interested in this twist that Lacan gives to this notion. I will come back to that in a minute. But the way I kind of reason with them and then come to my own kind of conclusion is indicating that the human-like robot elicits a feeling of uncanniness because it reveals something about ourselves that maybe have even remained hidden, namely, the impossibility to understand, to fathom what makes us human. So the uncanny feeling not only is then a response to a lack of humanness of the robot, but rather a response to the inability to fathom and appropriate this difference, and hence what we call humanness. So not only we respond to the robot because it's different from us, but also because we do not understand what makes this robot different from us, because we don't understand what makes us different from the robot. So what makes us human? So this is what I try to kind of make visible in kind of in reading this authors who provide a more psychological view of uncanniness. So just to sum up, my alternative explanations of the uncanny valley indicate that in confrontation with a human-like robot, I not only become aware of what makes me different from the robot, but also of the impossibility to appropriate this difference, again, because it confronts me with the existential question, who am I? Or what makes me human? So a question that also causes kind of a philosophical embarrassment, you could say, because actually we think we know what makes us human, but if we have to spell it out, we discover that we get in trouble and we are not able to do that. But at the same time, I think this is an important observation. So after having kind of covered that, I introduced this idea of the otherness of the self as extimacy, and this is kind of a way to make clear or to kind of further elaborate that we are also strangers to ourselves, that we also never can completely understand and appropriate who we are. And I use this notion of extimacy, so it's a neologisms that I actually borrow from Lacan, Jacques Lacan. I will tell you more about him in a second. So we have a kind of an extimate relation to ourselves in a certain sense. So we are both inside and outside ourselves, to put it more philosophically, but I will try to explain it in a couple of steps. So what I take from Lacan is this idea that our discovery of ourself is in a certain sense mediated. So being conscious of ourself is mediated by something outside of us, and this is kind of an experiment that made Lacan very famous. What he observes in a toddler, in a child, somewhere between 6 months and 1.5 years, he says, and we all, or maybe you also, and especially if you have children or know children, you have seen that there is this moment that the child looks into the mirror and then discovers, hey, the person looking back, that's me. That's not another child, that's me. So he becomes conscious of himself because he's confronted with his own image. What Lacan tries to illustrate is that this confrontation, so discovering, becoming conscious of ourselves, is actually made possible by something outside of ourselves, in this case, a mirror. And of course, he also gives other explanations of this kind of being, yeah, this discovering ourselves by the responses of the outside world. For another example is our parents, the way our parents respond to us, also project their views on us. But the point is that even our consciousness, the very kind of first awareness of ourself, is actually kind of discovered by something or through something outside of ourselves. And what Lacan tries to show and argue is that this is not only something, a moment in our kind of personal history, but this represents what he calls a permanent, or what I call a permanent structure of subjectivity. So this is something that always stick to us, is always a fundamental dimension of our selfhood, that we are actually, in a certain sense, strangers to ourselves, because even the kind of the very first discovery of ourselves has been made possible by something else. So we always need something else, something outside of us, to be able to interpret ourselves, or to even, in this case, discover who or what we are. So this is the kind of Lacanian original alienation concept. So, and then of course he's French, he uses all these neologisms and makes it very, very fundamental and big. And he uses terms like, unlike properties, or sentences like, unlike properties, my selfhood or ownness escapes me. I do not own it. It's not something for me or of me. It's rather something about me that I cannot domesticate. So in other words, there is something in me that I cannot control. In all my attempts to control it, I recognize and need to recognize that it escapes me, and might even be something that is dangerous for me. So that also explains why sometimes we do things that are not that smart. So we cannot even explain it to ourselves, and still we do them. So in other words, there is something in us that we cannot completely control. And of course, in being a psychoanalyst, he focuses on different drives that we cannot domesticate. That in one way or another always, I mean, we try to control them, but we never completely succeed in that. What Lacan is foremost interested in, besides this kind of what he calls the real order, so this world of drives, or what constitutes this world of drive, he is also interested in two other kind of dimensions which he calls the imaginary order or order, and the symbolic order or order. So besides drives that we cannot control, he says, there is also the kind of first interaction I already gave the example of the mirror, that we need to become conscious of ourselves, but also, for example, the interaction with a parent who tells us who or what we are, or even tells us what we should become. So this is still what he calls a dyadic relation. But then he says, gradually we also discover that we are part of a bigger whole, a culture, And then he introduces this notion of the symbolic order. He says the symbolic order, or the symbolic order, which he characterizes primarily as the order of the law, of customs, of language, that also the order that we need actually to be able to even understand who we are. So if I have to explain who I am, you see, I use language, and this language is to a certain in a certain sense external. I was born in it, so I cannot control it. But at the same time, I need it to even explain to you who or what I am. So in other words, this symbolic order is not something that I can control, but it defines me to a certain extent. So that also explains that we never are masters in our own home, you could say. The things that I add to that, because Lacan, being a psychoanalyst and also very much influenced by language theory, although he is actually in his work, he mentions also sometimes technologies, and I have to point out that the mirror is actually a technology, but he does not kind of uh, put a lot of emphasis on that. What I try to do also, because of the era that we're living, emphasize that this, what he calls the symbolic order, um, needs to be complemented with what I call a technological order, and this technological order is becoming maybe at least as important as what Lacan calls the symbolic order. So also this technological order is becoming an order, an own, at the same time. So on the one hand, it is something external, so something that maybe we built or other have built, but at the same time, it if you are born in this order, it also shapes you in a certain way. So limiting, in that sense, also your liberty. But the thing is, and that's the interesting element or aspect of this notion of extimacy. Technology is both the necessary condition for forming ourselves, especially in our culture. So we cannot form ourselves properly without this technology. But at the same time, you could say it's an obstacle that prevents it from reaching, that prevents us from reaching also the autonomy and singularity that we seek. So on the one hand, we have to recognize that we are very much shaped by this technology. And at the same time, we also have to kind of accept that, or we also want to kind of not be completely determined by this technology, and also form ourselves in a way that we say, yeah, this fits us. And then the question is how to critically relate to this external technology. So this technology that's not something that you can externalize, put just outside of you, because that would make things simpler. No, it is already inside, because you are born in it. It's everywhere, and from the beginning on. So it was already there even before you were conscious of it and conscious of yourself. So we have to maximally recognize that we are very much shaped by this technology, but at the same time we want to relate to it critically. And then the question is how to do that. How to critically relate to something that has shaped us in a very radical and strong way, and is increasingly shaping us. Especially, I mean, I cannot go into them. If you focus on this more kind of intrusive technologies, this intrusive emerging technologies. So we need to kind of add the technological to the symbolic. So technologies, not only language, but also technologies are shaping the self. And so also the technological order is becoming, just like Lacan says about the symbolic order, an order and an own at the same time. So in that sense, it is intimate and extimate at the same time. It's inside and outside at the same time. It's something that has shaped us, but at the same time, we try to distance ourselves from it, and and evaluate it or relate to it critically, because we want to form ourselves also autonomously, and in a way that we say, okay, this is what I want to become, and then the question is how to do that. And just to further elaborate this idea, I introduced this notion of being closed open, and I take that actually from another author, Jean-Luc Nancy. Very briefly said something about him. So he wrote this little book, translated as The Intruder, and it's kind of a biography, because in this book it's kind of a narrative, and he looks back to his own illness, because he became ill, he needed a heart transplantation, and he just kind of makes the reader witness of what happened to him. And that's interesting, because this is another way actually to illustrate that we are both familiar and strange to ourselves. Nancy says, first my heart it was an ally. I didn't even notice my heart, I mean, when it was healthy, but then it became sick, and it became also kind of a foreigner, and not even a foreigner, not only a foreigner, but also a very dangerous kind of foreigner, something that could kill me. So this is a first kind of observation, kind of recognizing that your body, in this case your heart, is you and not you at the same time. And then he kind of illustrates that this not only applies to his heart, but there are many other forms of strangeness. So besides the heart, there is the donor heart that he gets, and he says this donor heart might be a donor heart of somebody who's much younger than me. Maybe now I have an organ that's 20 years younger than me, so that also creates strangeness. But then he becomes ill, so he also kind of develops cancer, and then the cancer cells, I mean his own cells, become foreign to him. But the point ultimately that he tries to make is not about the heart or the heart transplantation, but the point that he tries to make is that there is something about ourself, our identity as such, that is own and strange at the same time. So I quote him, he says, "Never has the strangeness of my own identity, which I've nonetheless always found so striking, touched me with such acuity." So this kind of experience taught him that not only his heart and not only his body, but his very self is strange to him. So in other words, what we call ourself is both familiar and strange at the same time. And technology, because this is also something that he explains in this little essay, he observed that technology became an inherent and structural part of the self, because in this surgery, the body allowed all kind of interventions that just kind of succeeded. So the technologies used to treat Nancy are not strangers from outside that infringe the self, but rather the self has always been part of that outside technology, he says. Otherwise, this technology would not be successful in kind of adjusting, even giving us a heart transplantation. And he even says, "I'm turning into something like a science fiction android." So his point is that has always been the case. We have always been part of kind of a bigger technological infrastructure. And that also explains why we are not completely our own. We do not completely possess ourselves, because we are also part of a whole technological structure that we do not possess, which makes this relation to ourselves complicated, and something that we need to reflect on. But what is happening today with this new and emerging technologies, Nancy claims, these technologies have expanded the possibilities to introduce in this closed open self. So, in other words, technologies not only extend the self, which is a different theory that I will not go into today, but he claims, and I find that actually a more interesting view, the self has always been open and exposed, but now he says, with these new and emerging technologies, intrusive technologies, these new technologies are excessively confiscating it. So now it becomes even easier, you could say, to intrude in this closed open self, which makes it also even more important to critically relate to what these technologies are doing to us and the direction and the way they are shaping us. So if you add Lacan to Nancy, then you can, or by adding Lacan and Nancy, I come up with this notion of the technological extremacy. So technology is becoming strange and familiar at the same time. And technology is on the one hand part of the self, because the self is being born, and this technology in the technology, and this technology increasingly shapes the self. But at the same time, we also want and have the kind of desire to distance ourselves from this technology and reflect on it critically, or at least we hope and try to do that. So you could say, and this is kind of another twist, not only we respond to the human in the android, going back to the traditional notion of the uncanny valley, but we also discover that there is also an android in the human. So what elicits the uncanny feeling is not only the lack of humanness in the android, but also the android in the human. It also creates or brings about this strange uncanny feeling. And upcoming pursuits of technology will influence our wishes and desires more seamlessly, making it even harder to recognize them as being projected by others. So, in other words, because these technologies are not only gradually everywhere, think about the explosion of kind of development of sensors. We are embedding our environment with we putting a lot of sensors in our environment, actually transforming what you could call an natural ecosystem to an artificial ecosystem. So it's not only that these technologies are everywhere, but they also become more and more invisible. So we don't even realize that they are influencing us, which makes it even more important to be critical towards the way they are influencing us and the way they are shaping us. Okay, and this is a bit kind of where I end by addressing actually the problem. I don't kind of give an answer to this problem. Actually, I just have written a book in which I do try to answer that question, and I do that by introducing the notion of sublimation. And I cannot go into this notion here, but I think it is important, at least to appreciate the importance and the relevance of this fundamental question. So we seem to be kind of in a deadlock. On the one hand, we have to recognize that technologies are shaping us. On the other hand, we also want to shape ourselves, you could say, and how to deal with that, how to uphold or develop what I call the singular self in the light of our intrinsic technological condition. And my answer is sublimation, and more particularly, I've been inspired by an American philosopher, Charles Sanders Peirce, and I use him actually to help me to develop this notion of sublimation in this particular context. So very briefly, and again, I cannot elaborate it further. What sublimation indicates is that we have to try to uniquely live with the android within. So the point is that technology not only conditions our humanness, but we can also consciously employ it to condition our humanness in a certain way and to form ourselves in a certain direction. So the point is that the self should not be approached as something that has to close or learn to open itself for technology. So this is you can only make this claim if you take as a starting point, if you presuppose that technology is something outside of us. But if you say technology is something intrinsic, so it has always been there in a certain sense, the challenge is to live critically with this technology, which again from the beginning is already inside. I end with a definition of sublimation that I elaborate further in this book, but just to give you something and then stop. So sublimation I define as appropriating intrusive technologies by virtue of an ultimate aesthetic ideal that secures a permanent void in order to give ourselves both a socially valued and singular form. I hope this definition will not give you nightmares tonight. I hope you have enjoyed the lecture, and thank you for your attention, and good luck with finishing the course. And I hope to also see you actually maybe in the future, and to have a discussion, and we will have that next week online about this topic. Thank you.